Hello, my name is Cupin, and you are watching Rappler. Much has been said about President Ferdinand Marcos Jr.'s visit to the U.S. Malacanang has boasted of pledges, 1.5 billion US dollars in investment promises, although I have to note we've yet to see even the pledges made earlier come to fruition, but that's another topic altogether. But much attention is on the defense agreements and promises that were spelled out or made during the Philippine president's 5-day visit to Washington, D.C. Again and again, the U.S.'s quote ironclad commitment to defending the Philippines, especially in the South China Sea, was given emphasis across all the different meetings and engagements in the U.S. capital. But what does this mean for the country? As it finds itself more and more in the middle of US and China's growing competition, and especially given the tensions in the South China Sea. Speaking with me today, all the way from Washington, D.C., to help me make sense of it all is Elina Noor. Elina is a senior fellow at the Carnegie Asia Program with a focus on Southeast Asia. It's quite a complicated issue. I think that is quite a gut issue for a lot of Filipinos. So hopefully Elina can walk us through it and make us understand it a little bit better. Thank you for joining us, Elina. It's quite early in your part of the world.
Thank you for having me, Bea. Yes, I hope I'll be able to do justice to helping everyone walk through this.
Maybe to start, what does this visit tell you about how the U.S. sees the Philippines?
My sense is that the US has been waiting for this moment. And President Marcos's visit to Washington sealed the deal, so to speak. I mean, there's still a lot more left to discuss, but Washington is very welcoming of this revitalization of the alliance relationship. It
Yeah.
seems to be all about defense and security, at least that's what the headlines make it seem to be. But there is a very strong economic commercial component yet to be unfolded. So we're all going to wait and see how that pans out. But for now, the reinvigoration of defense and security ties for both sides, I think, is something that both capitals are embracing.
Yeah. Months before this, Malacanang primarily announced the four sites that would be included under EDCA open to American boots. There was a lot of talk, but Marcos seems very persistent and sure in basically continuing the commitment under EDCA that was stalled under Rodrigo Duterte. But he has said in no vague terms at all that he doesn't want these bases used for offensive operations. He's been very careful about emphasizing that this is supposedly for relief operations, for instance, should another calamity hit the Philippines. Given those talk points, what does the U.S. hope to get then if Marcos isn't or the Philippines isn't explicitly saying that yes, you can use these bases should tensions erupt in Taiwan or the South China Sea?
Yeah, you're right to point that out. And I think both sides are very sensitive to some of the domestic opposition in the Philippines, but also how it appears to President Marcos himself, his image as this newish president, as a statesman. And so the talking points on both sides, Manila and Washington, have been very cautious in talking about, as you pointed out, Bea, contingencies that include natural disasters. But the details of how the bilateral defense guidelines, for example, will be operationalized are still to be determined. We haven't seen much beyond top level announcements, which are, again, welcome on both sides. But I think both Manila and Washington are trying to figure out where the comfort zone for the both of them is going to lie, especially with the geopolitical overlay of Taiwan coming into play.
Right. I find it very interesting. Like even on off-record briefings, White House officials, Biden officials are very cautious in when they're asked by the U.S. media, "Will you demand or not really demand, but will you ask this from President Marcos?" I noticed they're very careful in answering those questions.
That's right. And actually, there was a reference back to the Mutual Defense Treaty
Mm.
between the US and the Philippines in 1951. And if you look at the wording of the treaty itself, it talks about how both sides will come to consultation with each other from time to time. And we'll probably see this from time to time come into play more and more as tensions heat up around the region.
Right. He has said before that during his sauna, actually, that the foreign our foreign strategy is to be friend to all, enemy to none. He's expounded on that recently, although some might barely see it as an expansion of that notion. No, he says that it's a strategy that's geared towards peace. He's even perhaps poked fun at himself and called it a simplistic strategy. But how do you operationalize this so-called strategy for peace when you're the Philippines? Like, you're so close to Taiwan, you're right beside the South China Sea. In fact, the West Philippine Sea, our exclusive economic zone, is, it's where China has a lot of aggressive moves against Filipino boats.
Right, and the Philippines has been at the forefront of that Chinese aggression, of course, which makes it a little different from the other South China Sea claimants in the region.
Yeah.
So, to be fair, a lot of Southeast Asian countries talk about this idea of advancing national interests and promoting peace and stability and prosperity in the region as their strategy for dealing with major power competition. But you're right, Bea, it's a lot more complicated for the Philippines, particularly with recent incursions by Chinese vessels and some of the aggressive and belligerent moves that have been taking place only in the recent months. So I think there are several ways to look at this. One is that this is a strategy, right, that President Marcos has talked about. How do you operationalize strategy? Well, you do it through steps, tactics, and daily measures. In fact, a lot of Southeast Asian countries talk about not wanting to choose, but the reality is that there are choices being made every single day on different issues. And so, in one sense, the Philippines has made its choice by being a treaty ally to the United States. But at the same time, it's also trying to balance that relationship with China, knowing full well that China is its biggest trading partner, is a potential source of huge investment. Although I know Filipinos can dispute that, particularly since
Mm.
the example of the last few years haven't played out as expected.
Yeah.
But all these different decisions taking place on different days. President Marcos has talked about establishing a hotline, a direct communication line between himself and China at the highest levels, for example. These are all ways to operationalize a larger strategy. Now, whether each of those parts come to make a sum that makes sense at the end of the day is a balancing act that, to be fair, all countries in Southeast Asia are still trying to grapple with.
Yeah. Speaking of the delicate balance and things that are complicated, we already mentioned it, Beijing. Like when Marcos went to Beijing for the state visit in January, it was quite a visit in that they promised a new golden age, a maturing of relations between Manila and Beijing. How are they seeing this now? Like, I mean, sentiments in the Philippines, but you can't deny that they're a huge, their biggest trading partner. How do they see this now? Marcos going to Washington twice or thrice, or actually, just to emphasize that the defense secretary of the U.S. promising to have our back in the South China Sea. So how does this make sense from the point of view of Beijing?
So, if you're sitting from a window in Beijing, you're obviously going to be very unnerved
Yeah.
and concerned, right? Because the expansion of the EDCA sites, obviously, two are in Cagayan now and very close to Taiwan, which is what China has voiced concern about. And they're saying, of course, as you have reported, Bea, that this is targeted at them because of the Taiwan issue. So they've expressed their disapproval, and I think it's incumbent upon Malacanang and all the other government agencies to try to temper some of those flare-ups that may grow and increase in the South China Sea because of this potential misperception that the expansion of the EDCA sites, for example, is geared towards Taiwan. The South China Sea is the dispute between Manila, as well as Beijing over the South China Sea, is one layer that has driven the expansion of defense relations between the US and the Philippines. But it's complicated now because of this Taiwan overlay. And I think as Washington and Manila try to figure out what it is they want individually and how they can work together collectively to operationalize the bilateral defense guidelines, then that will be an interesting evolution to watch as we go forward.
As a reporter covering the palace, it's been quite interesting to see how, or trying to, it's been interesting trying to understand what Beijing's play is. Because again, after that state visit, a lot of hype, maybe you would say, over, again, maturing ties, a better relationship, a more mature relationship between Manila and Beijing. And yet, right after, you have that laser pointing incident. And then days before leaving for Washington, a near collision as reported by the Philippine Coast Guard. What's happening? How does this make sense from China's perspective, right? Like, I guess for the average Filipino, it's hard to understand how China is saying that they're our friend, and at the same time, they're pointing lasers at us.
Yeah, there's a disjuncture in rhetoric and reality, right?
Yeah,
So I think Beijing is going to have to come to terms with this recalibration in Malacanang's policy. It
yeah,
got used to this period of relative calm under President Duterte and better ties with Manila. But I think if we go back even further to President Aquino's
yeah,
time in office, that going to President Duterte's time marks a shift as well. And I think
yeah,
Beijing just got comfortable with that lull in the
yeah,
relationship. Now it's
yeah.
shifted back again. So it's a recalibration on Manila's part as Manila sees it. But I think
Yeah.
Beijing is going to have to figure things out and get a little more comfortable with how things pan out. And obviously it's not, which is why it's acting the way it is.
Although it is also interesting, 'cause I mentioned earlier that the Biden officials are quite careful about answering questions related to EDCA. Beijing has also been very careful in criticizing EDCA, for instance. They make it a point to criticize the US and not so much Marcos. I found it funny actually during the interview before he left for the UK. The Philippine president said, "I don't feel alluded to," when Beijing was calling out the meddling in the South China Sea.
Right. But in a way, it's insulting, right? Because Beijing usually says, well, the US plays Big Brother everywhere in the world. And the assumption is that there's no agency by countries in Southeast Asia, in this case, to act on its own and to make its own decisions. But I don't think it realizes that it's doing essentially the same thing and it's mirroring these policies and approaches that it's criticizing.
Right, right. Another interesting thing that we've seen under the Marcos administration, although this one started out a little more subtle, but now we see the Coast Guard speaking out, the Philippine Coast Guard. I mean, they've more or less in the past few months become the face of China's aggressive moves against uh, Filipinos in the West Philippine Sea. How do you make of that strategy, apparently deployed by Manila now?
Yeah, it's a trend actually that was probably kickstarted by China because of China's growing use of its own coast guard. A lot of other countries in the region felt compelled to enhance and improve the capabilities and the image of their coast guards themselves. So, Vietnam, for example, has tried to upgrade its coast guard capabilities. And we've seen now, as you pointed out, the Philippines kind of frontlining its coast guard, and it's already there. It's facing a lot of these muscular actions by China. So it's a natural progression in a way that there is more involvement of coast guards because China started really ramping up its coast guard facilities. It was outfitting them with all sorts of armaments that are not typical of coast guards in the region. And if you look at China's coast guard vessels, they're essentially retrofitted naval vessels that are far larger than the largest Coast Guard vessels by any Southeast Asian Coast Guard force. I think, though, that this could be potentially quite dangerous because traditionally Coast Guard forces have been law enforcement forces. They haven't really been a part of the military. But China's increasing militarization of its Coast Guard is prompting some of these developments to take place. And it leaves kind of the rules and guidelines about how Coast Guards interact with each other in a gray zone.
Yeah. I've talked to other experts as well, and they pointed out, correctly, I would think that this is a very different Manila, very different Philippines from the Philippines under President Aquino. I remember as a reporter even then, just reading about how, frankly, sad the Philippine military was at the time. Ours is not the best quite yet, but it's vastly improved since then. And you also pointed out again that Manila isn't we're like the Philippines isn't like a hapless character here. It has it has agency. But what is Manila's leverage in the dynamics, not just in the region, in the South China Sea? Like what does Washington get, and what does Beijing get from the Philippines in this context?
Well, Washington gets a tighter defense relationship, something it's always wanted, right? And its priorities and needs may differ, probably do differ a lot from Manila's uh, with regard to what's going on at the geopolitical level. Um, Now, what does Beijing get out of it? Well, I think Beijing is still hopeful for a nuanced relationship with Marcos, despite the closer ties between Manila and Washington. And I think, to his credit, President Marcos has tried to walk this line, this fine line, very delicately, and he appears to be successful so far. Now, there are a lot of variables up in the air, as you pointed out, Bea. You know, there's supposed to be this presidential business delegation that U.S. Commerce Secretary Gina Raimondo is supposed to be heading to the Philippines. And U.S. aid pledges have really been pledges. So there's a bit of a gamble going on here, just as there was a lot of criticism about President Duterte not really getting as much out of his deals with China as was expected. I think if Washington doesn't deliver
Right.
to Manila, then there will be a difference and possibly a minor recalibration in
Right.
approaches as well.
And it's a huge pressure too on President Marcos because I mean he's been traveling a lot. It's a recurring criticism here in the Philippines, and he's justified it by saying, "I'm getting a lot of pledges," but like I said earlier, they've so far remained pledges since his first trip abroad up until today. There haven't Nothing has really become concrete quite yet. So the pressure is two sided. It's also on Malacanang to actually make sure they follow through.
Sure, yeah.
Yeah. It just concluded in Indonesia, the ASEAN summit. President Marcos has constantly mentioned, the role of ASEAN, but I feel like sometimes this is such a frustrating conversation because it's been 20 years since ASEAN and China promised to create a code of conduct. I don't think that's happening anytime soon. Two questions. What role should ASEAN play given the geopolitical tensions in the region and specifically in the South China Sea? And then a reality check. What role can ASEAN play in the region given these geopolitical tensions?
You know, I criticize ASEAN a lot too, but I do it out of love, right? Because really, if we think about it, without ASEAN, what other alternatives are there? And yes, the discussions around the code of conduct have taken forever. But we also have to remember that discussions around the declaration on the code of conduct took almost as long, even longer at this point in time.
Right.
Um, but without those discussions, again, what alternatives can there be? So I think there are several tracks that ASEAN should be proceeding on. One, of course, is to continue the negotiations on the code of conduct. And I think part of the reason it's taking so long is because there is no easy agreement on some of these issues. Beijing prefers one thing, a number of the Southeast Asian countries prefer the other thing. We have to remember this is not just between Beijing and Southeast Asian countries, it's Beijing and different claimants in Southeast Asia itself. Now, your second question, what could ASEAN do? Well, I mean, some of that is probably taking effect behind the scenes, right?
Mm.
So I think, again, because the negotiations have been taking so long, the negotiators and the lawyers have probably been pushing as hard as they can on all sides. What else could it do? I think it could come together in a more cohesive way when it comes to pronouncing on some of these political security issues. Is it going to do that? Probably not, because of the differing interests. So mainland Southeast Asian countries are not as interested in what goes on in South China Sea dispute. And arguably, you could say that if something were to take place on one of the mainland Southeast Asian countries, maritime Southeast Asian countries might not take such an interest either. So it's one of those, inherent difficulties of 10 different countries, now possibly 11 with East Timor coming together and trying to figure out what their priorities are, what their capacities are, what their resources are. But I think in the absence of any other regional mechanism, ASEAN is the best thing that we've got. And that includes the very thorny issue of Myanmar as well. There has been no other diplomatic framework that is as procedurally substantive and that can be interpreted loosely as the 5 point consensus right now, despite all the criticisms against it.
Right, right. Uh, as we're talking about this, as we're conversing, I realize it hasn't even been a year of a Marcos presidency, second Marcos presidency. His father was a dictator for over 2 decades, but a lot of things have happened in terms of recalibrating between China and the U.S. But like, what things will you be looking at or monitoring closely with regards to how the Philippines navigates its role in what seems to be tension that's just might just blow over anytime soon in the South China Sea and Taiwan? Like, what key indicators should we be looking out for?
Yeah, I don't envy the Philippines vis-a-vis the South China Sea dispute because you guys are really at the forefront of, unfortunately, China's muscularity. Um, and, I think it will really have to be a very challenging time for the Philippines Coast Guards, but also the Philippines lawyers as they try to implement, operationalize the arbitration award that was given to the Philippines. I know there have been a lot of calls to do more with that.
Yeah.
On some of the other fronts, I think it's particularly interesting that the US and Philippines bilateral defense guidelines mention over the horizon issues like space and cyberspace. I suspect that largely came from Washington, so I'd be curious to see how that plays out in practice.
Yeah.
And also, on the commercial investment front, President Marcos has touted the Philippines' natural resources as a way to attract investment. A lot of nickel, a lot of cobalt in the Philippines. But given the climate crisis that we're facing right now, despite all the talk about green tech and green energy supplies, the extraction and processing of nickel and cobalt are not the cleanest and greenest of ways to sustainable development. So I'd be curious to see how Malacanang balances between its SDG pledges on the one hand and the attraction of investment on the other.
Yeah. And that's a huge pressure in the Marcos administration because although in his campaign his promises were vague, they've become more concrete and much bigger since he assumed office. So that's something we're definitely looking to monitor in the coming.
Yeah, it's short-term gains over long-term, not just environmental but also local
Right.
community impacts, right?
Right, exactly. Thank you so much, Elina, for your time. Again, it's quite early in your part of the world. Thank you for walking us through and helping us understand um, just a little better what the trip means for not just Manila, but I guess the rest of the region as well.
Thank you, Bear, for having me. I had fun. I hope everyone else found it useful.
Thank you again, and thank you for watching Rappler. Keep it here for more updates, not just in Washington and Manila, but also on other things concerning the Philippines' diplomatic ties, but also Philippine news in general. Keep it on Rappler. This has been Cupin. Thank you. Bye bye.